My name is Sarah Van Exen. I'm GreenPAC's outgoing executive director. Our new executive director will be announced later this afternoon, and we can't wait to introduce you to her. She is wonderful, and we're really thrilled to have her leadership as GreenPAC moves into our 10th year. If you aren't familiar with us, GreenPAC is not a political or a policy shop. We're a nonpartisan nonprofit, and we work across party lines to build environmental leadership in politics. So during elections and in between, we run programs and projects and events that are all about building literacy and capacity, collaboration across party lines, and urgency for action and leadership in environmental politics. I'm really grateful to be joining you today from land that's the traditional territory of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, Wendat peoples, as well as the Mississaugas of the Credit, and is also now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. Coming out of an election where neither climate change nor reconciliation got a lot of airtime, I'd also like to acknowledge that a clean and resilient and climate safe future cannot be realized without prioritizing Indigenous knowledge rights, relationships, and sovereignty. It's now my pleasure to welcome our panelists, so I'll invite them to come off camera now. Okay, awesome. Alex, I will introduce first, both alphabetically and because she gets points for taking this call from the great outdoors. Alex Cool-Fergus is the National Policy Manager at Climate Action Network Canada. Thanks for joining us, Alex.
Thanks so much. So excited to be here.
Great. We also have Andrew Heffernan, who's a climate associate at the Information Integrity Lab and an adjunct professor at the University of Ottawa. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
Okay, terrific. And we also have Ross Linden Fraser, who's a research lead at the Canadian Climate Institute. Welcome, Ross.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think in our Eventbrite, we had this event scheduled to run for about 75 minutes, but we'll do our best to wrap up at 2 because we know most people's attention wanes after an hour, unless you have a lot of questions for our panelists, and we'll try and stick around a little longer if that's the case. So please use the Q&A function to add your questions. We'll get to those towards the end. And so now, if everyone's good to go, we'll dive into some questions. We kind of have this event divided into a couple of sections, as you probably saw from the Eventbrite, talking about policy and then looking maybe a little bit at the politics that will need to be navigated to get the policy through. And then we'll also be talking about communications and how important that is to being able to advance a robust climate agenda during these really fractious times. Okay, so maybe just as a bit of context here, I'll just maybe state the obvious, say what probably doesn't need to be said, which is that, you know, the past 6 months, I think, have been a truly remarkable time on the policy and, or sorry, on the political and geopolitical sort of landscape. And now we're going into a 45th Parliament that I think none of us, nobody could have foreseen, you know, even 6 months ago. Climate definitely took a bit of a backseat in terms of voter priorities in this election, and political and media attention too, but it was very much deeply intertwined with all of the central election issues that mattered to Canadians. Okay, so climate change is obviously a deadly serious and urgent priority, but we're going to try and keep this conversation a little casual and light. And so panelists, you know, I've got some questions for you. I'll have some prompts for you, but I really just welcome you to be conversational with each other and to ask questions of each other as we go forward. Okay, so to get the conversation started, maybe we can take a look at how climate and the environmental agenda fits into the next federal agenda, and maybe what I'll do is turn it to Ross. You know, we don't have mandate letters yet. We have the platform commitments to work with. We have campaign trail promises. Um, and Ross, we also have some things that are still on the table from the last government that Prime Minister Carney has committed to finishing or improving on. So I wonder if maybe you could start by giving us a sense of what some of the big pieces are there.
Yeah, absolutely. I can think of a couple of ways to tackle that question. I guess one is to talk about the commitments that the new government has made that are specific to climate, or where climate fits into some of their broader commitments. And then maybe at the very end, I can tack on some policies or issues that were priorities of the previous government that could play a role in the politics of the current government. So at the Canadian Climate Institute, we have our eyes on a few files that are close to the heart of this government's agenda. And as you were talking, Sarah, I just made a couple of notes here. And what I've written down here is climate policies that intersect with the government's competitiveness agenda, policies that intersect with the goals to build big and small things, whether it's major projects or housing, and then the broader lens of affordability, which may have played a smaller role in platforms than they might have, say, a year ago, but is still very much present. So when we talk about competitiveness, the government's committed to, keeping Canadian industries strong, responding to challenges in the broader trade environment, and making sure that Canada's role as a major exporter and trading nation are successful. And for the Canadian Climate Institute, that really intersects very closely with one of the key climate policies that exists both at the federal and provincial level, and that is industrial carbon pricing. And not only did the government's platform include a commitment to maintain these systems, it also included a commitment to strengthen the systems. And from our perspective, that's important. Obviously, for competitiveness, these systems are designed to enhance the long-term competitiveness of Canadian industries. They're designed to ensure that we can continue exporting products. And they're also the country's leading mitigation policy. They are the leading measure to decarbonize industries. So we think that climate policy is going to play a really important role, not just on the climate file, but in the competitiveness file. And then when it comes to constructing things, whether it's major projects or housing, we're keeping an eye on a couple of things. I'm sure we will talk more about the government's approach to energy of various kinds, but there was a commitment in the platform to build out the country's transmission grid and to maintain the investment tax credits that were originally introduced in by the last government, including an electricity investment tax credit. And so that's a major initiative that, again, can enhance Canada's competitiveness and would involve building big things, whether it's more electricity capacity, more transmission capacity, et cetera. And then the last thing that I'm thinking of is housing. We've talked a lot about housing at various levels, and there's an important intersection there, not just between whether you're heating your house with a furnace or a heat pump, but it's also where you're siting your house. The Climate Institute did a big research project last year. One of the things we pointed out is that Canadians could be on the hook for a lot of damages from wildfires and flooding if we don't site all the houses that we want to build appropriately. So those are three policy buckets that we're keeping an eye out for that intersect with the government's agenda. And there are a host of measures from the last government that we're curious to see, like new strengthened methane regulations for the oil and gas sector and others. But I've gone on at length, so why don't I leave it there?
Okay, cool. Thank you very much, Ross. And maybe we can turn it to Alex. Alex, I think as Ross signaled, we should maybe spend a bit of time on energy. I think we've got a bit of a mixed bag here, and it would be great to hear from you, what some of the key planks are, and maybe some of the things you're feeling a little more worried about or have your eye on in terms of how climate and energy energy and electricity stuff moves forward.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, to your point earlier, Sarah, like there has been so much change over the past 6 months that it's kind of hard to like know exactly where we're at, and things are constantly in flux. But definitely with the, no surprise, like increase attention given to the United States and to our energy security and sovereignty, there has been like not a never before seen, but almost conversation about energy across the country. And what energy means to Canadians is wildly different. And it's pretty rare to find two people that have like a very similar kind of take on what's needed and what ultimately they want to see. So, we've seen a whole bunch of different polls. They say different kinds of things, but globally, I think we'll find that most Canadians are paying attention like never before to the question of energy security. And so, of course, like the politics of it is, I think, pretty clear, where the Conservative Party really ran on a platform of more oil and gas. And like they very much aligned with the demands of the oil and gas industry. It was almost exactly the same kind of recommendations. The Liberals were more cautious, I want to say, with regards to oil and gas. So they weren't necessarily throwing all of their or putting all their eggs in one basket there, but they remain open to an expansion of especially gas. Um, but on the other hand, they've also recommended the creation of a national electricity grid, which of course is really interesting and obviously necessary for the decarbonization that's going to be needed if we're not only to achieve 1.5 degrees, but also if we want to be safe from like volatile shifts in the global and energy landscape. So yeah, I mean, I think today, great timing for this webinar with the cabinet just being announced. We were very interested to see what kind of signal that was going to be sending. And, I remain cautiously quite optimistic, actually, like given the different names and faces that we see on the cabinet, that the government seems to be telegraphing to Canadians that they are taking the electricity project seriously. There are lots of people who are very climate literate, very energy literate, sitting around the cabinet table now. And I mean, of course, they're likely going to have very challenging conversations with one another and with the Parliament in general. But I think that it's safe to say that we should be expecting to see more investments in the investment tax credit for electricity, which we know is still not totally complete. We'll probably see some different pieces on electrification of, for example, home heating, like Ross was saying. Of course, there's like the big project that's been announced for like the eastern part of the country, or maybe the central part, depending on where you are, the high-speed rail project between Windsor and Quebec City. These are all things that would be massive and would have a humongous impact on our emissions, but also on Canadians' quality of life. And these are all things that have been promised in the Liberal platform. And so very curious to see how quickly those things happen. And the next couple of months are going to be fascinating. So maybe I'll end there.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, I want to turn it to Andrew to build on these things, but something that you said there, Alex, about the high-speed rail network makes me think, one of the significant narratives that we heard from the Liberals during the campaign was, and from Carney in particular, including through like a little video that attempted to explain what he was talking about, but was with this idea of spend less and invest more. And I think there were a few other kind of narratives that came out during the election, and I wonder, Andrew, like as you build on this, how do you see these kinds of narratives shaping the priorities and maybe the opportunities for climate action that we'll see from the next government, maybe building on the infrastructure or in other areas?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I think Alex finished by saying that, the next few months will be interesting. And I keep dreading that because I keep looking for some boring months in the world of the news and politics, both domestically and internationally. It would be nice if things were not interesting for a while. But unfortunately, I think she's right. I think it's probably going to be interesting. I guess to sort of the final question that you got at, I keep looking right above my head because I think that is Carney's book Values, which I just happened to finish last night, not necessarily planning to do so before this event. But it was interesting because I did hear during the campaign this division of how the accounting of these things are going to be done. And I think if you read this 450-page book, which is pretty dense at parts, it starts to well, it doesn't start. It thoroughly unpacks his thinking about this kind of thing. And I think it's going to be challenging. I mean, I think he's extremely ambitious, and I think it's a time that demands ambition. We'll see how that goes. I mean, over the past 10 years, a lot of the criticisms I think we heard of the Trudeau Liberal government was maybe at times that they were too ambitious, or that they weren't necessarily meeting those ambitions, or not able to meet the promises that they were making. And I think Carney is going to have a similarly difficult time meeting the moment, because it is such a difficult moment. But I do think that there's an important question, and we've touched on a lot of these kinds of things here, whether it is the high-speed rail corridor, whether it is this question of extracting, selling, producing more energy. And again, I think Alex put a really important question mark on what energy specifically means, because we do often hear about Carney's being very clear about making Canada an energy superpower. And I think to a lot of people that might mean pumping more oil or gas, but to others it might mean something else. And what it's probably going to mean is a confluence of all of these kinds of things. I don't think we're going to be turning off the taps tomorrow, but I also don't think that a Carney-led Liberal government is going to be all about, increasing our exports of oil and gas specifically. So I think trying to weave this complex environment between spending less, investing more, is going to be part of how we thread these difficult needles of climate policy, of energy policy moving forward. And I think thinking about how we account for these kinds of things from an accounting perspective is going to be important on them, because as you mentioned, we're kind of breaking this discussion up with sort of policy and politics. I mean, it's really hard to break up the two things, and I would say problematic to try to do so, because if Carney or any other politician in the country tries to develop some kind of well thought out policy, whether it's on energy, transportation, the economy, the environment, etc., if you don't think about the political ramifications of that, and if you don't have a well thought out communications plan for that policy, if you're not able to bring enough Canadians along, obviously it's not going to work. And again, I think we saw a bit of this failure to politically communicate with the Trudeau government on what were, I think, a lot of pretty good policies, because Canadians really do still care about climate change and the environment. And a vast majority of Canadians want the government to do something and to do more. But then, the real tricky parts gets into, like, what do they want that to look like? Because most Canadians also don't want that to be costing them anything identifiable or obvious in the short run. So weaving between those two things are going to be central to, again, Carney moving forward, but also how he's going to work with other governments across Canada and beyond Canada as well. I'll leave it for now, but a lot more for us to discuss over the next half hour or so.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. There's so much that we could cover on this front, and I know it's hard to cover it all. I also know that some of the other environmental areas aren't really the main bag of some of the folks on this of this panel, but I mean, there were also commitments around nature, around water, around Indigenous ownership and equity and in energy, and so I guess I just wanted to open it up to you all, maybe to come off mute and make this part a little more conversational. Is there anything else that you think is really important to highlight that you were glad to see in terms of the environmental agenda? Maybe I'll turn it to Ross first.
Sure. I can definitely talk about other things that we were interested to see, although I think I named off some of the Institute's key priorities. We don't work as much in the nature conservation space, although it was interesting to see the government making a series of commitments about expanding protected areas, having a water strategy. If you don't mind, Sarah, I was actually thinking of responding to something Andrew said. Is that okay?
Absolutely, go for it.
Andrew said something about, like, we're talking about building things, but build what? What do we mean by energy? And since you were asking, Sarah, about like the distinction between spending and investing and what all that looks like, what comes to my mind is, what are the tools that governments are using to build the things that they say they want to build? What tools are governments using to generate the incentives they want? And I'm interested in that. The Institute's interested in that because all of these things have implications logistically, if I could put it that way. A regulation is a different thing to introduce than a piece of legislation. An agreement to establish a new park requires a whole separate process than a policy that requires negotiations or consultations with provincial governments. The consultation process with Indigenous nations is different once again. So one of the things that we're curious about is when the government talks about investing, what are the tools? As Alex mentioned, 2 of the 6 investment tax credits announced by the previous government have not been legislated yet. Maybe we'll see those in the budget. If so, there'll have to be a Budget Implementation Act, and there'll be a whole process through which those get put into place. Whereas another policy I mentioned, the strengthened methane regulations for the upstream oil and gas sector, would be a regulation. Doesn't require any legislation. The consultation process is concluded. That, in theory, could be completed fairly quickly. Same goes for strengthened industrial carbon pricing. There's a whole negotiation process with the territories and provinces that have their own systems, but ultimately, those changes don't require a law to be made. The government can make those decisions itself. But if you're talking about electricity or building codes, there's a whole process of negotiation with various actors. And while the government has an ambitious agenda to build things, the weight of the different processes will have some impact on how quickly these things get done and how much gets spent.
Yeah, and I can build on some of that, sort of building on what Ross was saying, and also some of your questions that you were alluding to. I mean, you alluded to it in the introduction to this event, and it's obvious that I think that we've probably taken a step back from where we were going from a climate and environmental policy perspective. Clearly, Canadians just don't care about it as much, or are not demanding as much. The government has had, basically been forced to step back from the consumer portion of the carbon tax. So there's various reasons to be pessimistic. And some people, Danielle Smith actually has said, which Carney are we going to get? The one that wrote values, and then I think she would put some colorful language on that about him being some kind of, crazy left-wing, tree-hugging environmentalist or something like that. Or, the one who is friendly to Alberta and understands concerns in the West and economic development. And I think what I'm optimistic for, or at least hope for, is that I think what we will get with Carney and what we should hope for moving forward, it is, alluding back to what I mentioned before, it is that marrying of politics and policy in understanding that we are further and further into a climate changed world, and we are further and further into the climate crisis. I mean, it is upon us. We're probably not going to make our 1.5 degree goal. We might not hit our 2 degree goal, but there is work being done and more work to be done. And I think that Carney and his team are very aware of that. And as Alex said, there's a lot of signals being sent with that cabinet and even with the ministries of state. There are people in those positions that are very aware of this file. But I also think the way that things are being presented, he, his team, and now his cabinet are going to be increasingly aware of the changed political environment that we are in, right? And I often think of the example of President Biden's IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which sounds like it is simply meant to reduce inflation. When they spoke about it, their communications were all about economic growth and jobs. Jobs, jobs, jobs. And that was about it. It wasn't presented as a climate change or environmental policy or plan, but that's really what it was. I think it was, the most historic environmental and climate investment in the world, partly because they've got the largest economy and they are able to do so. But I think that's how we're going to have to go moving forward, and think less about there being a minister of the environment who works on environmental issues, and think more about the fact that we are in a broader context of a climate changed era. And every ministry is going to have to be thinking about that. Every arm of the government is going to have to be thinking about the environment and climate change and what their policies do to contribute to fighting climate change or not, as well as the other issues that exist in relation to the environment, or how they exacerbate those kinds of issues. And they can think about their policies and their specific agendas whether that is trade, military, etc. But understanding that it is in this new climate changed era, and thinking about that context whenever they are going about or however they're going about pursuing their mandate letters that they'll get in the coming days.
And I'll build off of what both Russ and Andrew were saying here to say that I think you're right, Andrew. Like we're not, to me, like the time, the era of having a climate policy be just a climate policy is over. So we're not going to see anymore like this is just about reducing emissions and that's all we're trying to do here. Like that. And I think that like for those of you who do advocacy or who run communications campaigns, like you have to pair climate with all the other co-benefits that lead to it, right? And so like I mean not to come back to this all the time, but I really find that this cabinet is fascinating for that. If you look at the different responsibilities, or at least nominally, right, there are multiple ministries that have the word resilience, or that are clearly geared towards protecting communities from climate from climate events, right? I think that's really important, and that's a really interesting piece where resilience is clearly spread across nature protection and water. Like these are things that are also spread across. You have Gregor Robertson in the role of housing and infrastructure. I mean, he was a previous mayor who brought incredible changes to the way that Vancouver was run, and really fundamentally understands the links between the climate crisis, the housing crisis, but also mitigation, right? And how to build climate adapted infrastructure. And so like these are people who really get it. And you see that there's like an intentional desire to kind of link these different pieces. And so to come back to your point or your question, Sarah, about what about biodiversity? What about like nature? And what about other environmental issues that we care about very, very dearly? I think that they're being woven into other ministries that where previously we wouldn't have expected to see them. And I think similarly, like there hasn't been much attention paid to the issue of adaptation, but it's a critically important issue, not only from a human perspective or a natural perspective, but also from an economic point of view. I mean, I don't have the numbers on hand, but like we are losing so much money as a society every year due to the impacts of climate change. And I've read some studies that demonstrate that it's actually a stronger hit to our GDP than the tariffs are, right? Like that's enormous. So adaptation is definitely something that's going to have to be taken into account more and more as we go forward. Maybe one note on Indigenous ownership and Indigenous management of land. I mean, I think that was like I did not hear a lot during the campaign about Indigenous rights and ownership and reconciliation or decolonization. That doesn't mean that it's not an important issue. And many of the promises that were made by the Liberals, but also promises that were made by other parties, are things that would require consent of Indigenous nations, or else they're simply not going to go forward. And so we can't become a critical mineral superpower without Indigenous nations and their support and ownership. Likewise, we can't build big energy projects, whether they're conventional or renewable, without consent. And so that is another, I think, area where I'm going to be looking to see what the signals are. We know that Indigenous communities are very diverse, have completely sometimes opposing views with regards to resource development and energy development. And I think that's normal, but it will be interesting to see how the Carney government performs with regards to that issue.
Thanks, Alex. Okay, well, let's stick with the politics for a little bit, which we, as Andrew said, it's inseparable, so we're already into that anyway. And Alex, thank you for highlighting a little bit about what you saw in the announcement of cabinet this morning, the swearing in of cabinet this morning. So yeah, maybe we're looking at a week till we see the mandate letters, and then we have the House back on, is it the 26th, I think? And we're expecting to see a budget shortly thereafter. I think the government told us a little bit in the platform about what we might expect to see when, but let's build on that a little bit. And maybe I'll turn to you, Ross, specifically to start with the budget. What are you expecting to see prioritized in the budget in terms of all these priorities we've just laid out?
I guess as a nonpartisan research organization, we try not to opine too often about what a government will or won't do, but let me give it a shot. There are a couple of measures, as I mentioned, that seem suited, or a couple of proposals that seem suited for a budget implementation bill that would require legislation. And the first one we've already mentioned a couple of times are the investment tax credits, the clean growth investment tax credits. I think that the two that have yet to be finalized are the clean electricity ITC and the electric vehicle supply chain ITC. So would expect those to be in the budget, one a larger item than the other. One thing we're intrigued by is the suggestions in the platform that the government is looking at ways to continue to incentivize Canadians to adopt clean technology in their own lives, whether that's electric vehicles or heat pumps, technologies that, don't just reduce emissions, but can also simplify people's lives, protect them from volatile fossil fuel prices, etc. And we're interested what mechanism the government will adopt. Will it return to consumer-facing subsidies as the previous government did for a number of years? The government hinted that it's looking at creating consumer-facing carbon markets or integrating rebate schemes within industrial carbon pricing systems. It would have been interesting to see some of those measures in the budget. And then Alex mentioned, we don't often talk about adaptation, but we also noted that there were a lot of references to resilience. There's lots of security themes that came up in the campaign and in platforms, and there are important security dimensions to climate policy, whether that's making housing or infrastructure more resilient, whether that's protecting people from volatile prices. And it will be interesting to see if there's additional funding for adaptation, fire prevention, resilient housing construction in the budget.
Andrew?
Yeah, so I mean, I would be looking for a lot of that. If I were to keep this pretty brief, what I would be looking for what I'm expecting more so than what I would be looking for is a fairly brief budget, not one that tries to do everything for everyone. Again, I think that might be one of the key criticisms or critiques of the Trudeau Liberals over the past 10 years. I mean, I don't think anybody can fault Trudeau and the Liberals for a lack of ambition. And while, as I've already mentioned, I think this is a time that calls for extremely ambitious responses from Carney and the rest of us, Canadians and beyond. I think that they would be forgiven for not having a fully fledged or fleshed out 150-page budget document that we often see, right? It's going to be an abridged version, and I think it'll be very focused on, again, the types of things that we've been hearing so much: the economy, jobs, growth, and from there, little pockets of things that allude to these kinds of tax incentives, and what I would see as kind of positive incentives that can be seen as not only helping people retrofit their houses, buy more sustainable technologies, vehicles, etc., but things that can also drive the economy by driving investments in our houses and our local communities and our infrastructure and that kind of thing. And those can be seen as opposed to something like, while we often talk about the previous consumer carbon tax as being a conservative approach to fighting climate change, and many economists would say it's the most efficient and effective way to do so, and I happen to largely agree with that. You can view it as a bit of a negative incentive in the sense that consumers are being penalized in a sense when they're consuming, whether it's at the pump or whatever. Now, it was revenue neutral, so you got the money back, and there's all those other things. But without getting into that, they felt that, or they saw that, or they were told that there was that penalty that was being applied to them, instead of the positive incentive that can be, you go buy this, you use this, invest in this home retrofit, you get more effective or efficient insulation in your house, which, insulation is not usually seen as something very sexy, but can actually make a big difference in achieving these kinds of climate goals that we're looking for. So I'm looking at, as I mentioned, jobs, growth, the economy, a short budget that focuses on those things. But if you peel back the layers and start thinking about it kind of, again, as Alex already mentioned, if you look at some of the names that are in cabinet, if you really peel back the the layers of the jobs, growth, economy focus that I expect to see in this budget, I think we'll see a lot of those kinds of positive economic incentives that are sort of meant to positively incent Canadians to invest in these kinds of sustainable solutions, which will also really help, hopefully mostly our domestic economy, but more broadly the sustainable economy as well.
And sorry, not to belabor the point, and I'll try to keep it short, but I think that one of the important indicators that Carney's probably going to want to be looking at over the coming months, and especially with regards to the budget, is what the provinces want. And I know that that's a whole that's a whole thing. I do not envy the people who are going to have to kind of compare what the provinces are looking for and try to find solutions for them. And I'm not saying that they're all going to get funded, but Carney has so far shown a stronger commitment to working with provincial governments of all stripes since he became the leader of the Liberal Party and Prime Minister. And I expect that he's going to want that to continue because so far that has been, I think, a pretty good strategy for him. Like he seems to have most of them relatively on board. Of course, there's always the Alberta exception, and fair enough. I'm a Quebecer. I understand that some provinces are challenging. But I think ultimately he's going to want to show some good faith there. So maybe look at what the provincial premiers are calling for, and see what, whether any of them align with what Carney has already said that he's going to do. And the last thing I'll say is, Carney was very clear, and I truly believe that he believes this, about our relationship with the United States, right? Where he says, our old relationship is gone. Like it's not coming back. And we shouldn't be trying to bring it back. And I don't think he's going to be in any hurry to really strike deals with the US, as we've seen a couple of other countries do. He's going to want to very much not only protect different Canadian industries from the impacts of the tariffs or the impacts of Donald Trump's whims, but he's going to really, really try to diversify different trading partners and move our different trade vulnerable sectors to a place where they are not so vulnerable. And so I think that to Andrew's point, there's going to be a lot about jobs for sure, but I think we might see some really interesting kind of pivots where it's not just about protecting our sectors, but it's also about kind of growing them in, I think, new and interesting ways from what we may expect. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, and if I can, I'll just jump in just to briefly add. And an example of that, I think, is really going to be like the EU, Europe in general, but the European Union. We saw that briefly, like as soon as Mark Carney won the Liberal leadership and became Prime Minister prior to the election, he quickly went to Europe to reinforce the fact that they are close partners of ours. We've talked about diversifying away from the US. The EU is a very obvious example. We have a lot of close trade ties with them already. And part of the reason I wanted to make this intervention is because this is also an important argument for continuing effective climate policy. Because while Trump is being Trump and the US might continue Trumpism even after Trump, presumably if he doesn't remain president, the EU is still, they've long been a leader on sustainability and the fight against climate change, and they will continue to be, we can hope at least. And they are not going to want to trade with actors who simply do not care about the environment and are, pursuing strict drill baby drill policies without having any kind of effective environmental measures in place. And I think that they are going to be more of an obvious partner moving forward for the types of diversification that we're looking for the kinds of trade we already have and expanding. But I think to do so and to avoid the kinds of tariffs that they are going to start putting in place on heavily polluting countries, we're going to want to and need to keep up effective climate action for our own immediate environmental and economic well-being, but also for those moving forward. Because I don't think that we can have a sustainable future economically. And maybe sustainability is not the right word in that point, because I'm not trying to mean from an environmental standpoint, but our economy cannot be sustained moving forward if we don't care about climate change and don't care about the environment. So it's really the right thing to do from an environmental perspective, but absolutely it's going to be fiscally moving forward as well.
Can I
yeah, go ahead.
add one last thought? Just a thought that there are some things that might temper my expectations about what to see in the budget that relate to things that both Alex and Andrew mentioned. Alex is absolutely right. What the province's priorities are going to play an important role. Interestingly enough, one of the things the provinces have been calling for, among other parties, is increased defense spending. And that's an item that was in the platform. We know that the platform also books space for a large tax cut or middle-class tax cut. There are a series of spending pressures that aren't immediately climate related that will have an influence on the kind of tools that the government is able to adopt. And both Alex and Andrew also alluded to challenging trade environment. And the government might set aside some fiscal room to support those industries. And it will also probably keep some fiscal room set aside, given the threat that trade measures might represent to the Canadian economy. So all of those competing pressures influence how much fiscal room there is for direct climate measures. And that's something that is in the back of my mind as I await the budget.
And ironically, just to double down on your point or push it even further, the more we have these investments, it leaves less fiscal room, and it also leaves less room for our carbon debt, right? I mean, if we keep investing in more military, which we're probably going to, and I think most people suggest it's probably needed to some degree, it's also going to push our environmental and climate capacities, not only to invest in those, but it's going to push our carbon debt further and further as well.
Thanks. Alex, maybe I'll go back to you. We'll just, you talked about working with the provinces, but maybe we could just spend a bit of time talking about other parties here, and the makeup of the House of Commons. I mean, as of right now, we've got a large majority. I think we're still sitting at 170, but I suppose things are fluctuating still. And yeah, so like the runway of this government is going to depend on whether public opinion polling remains in its favor, as well as its ability to maneuver things with the other parties. So maybe I could just ask you a two-part question. Like, so how do you think the makeup of what do you make of the makeup of this House of Commons in terms of how it will, influence the climate agenda, limit the climate agenda, or limit certain agendas, and then also maybe like, because you support an advocacy network across Canada, what kind of advice do you have in terms of the way that advocates can best work with this new parliament and cabinet? And maybe I'll include the Senate in there, in terms of making sure that this agenda remains ambitious and doesn't get derailed as other issues arise, which they surely will.
Yeah, okay. So let's start with the Senate. In part because it's like one of my favorite topics to talk about. I'm kind of obsessed with the Senate. First, I want to pitch my idea, which is we need more climate senators, right? And there are a few, and they're doing tremendous amounts of work. But overall, the Senate is not necessarily composed of people who have a really strong climate literacy. So I think that that's something that might change. I have no idea what Carney is thinking with regards to the Senate, but we know that under Trudeau, of course, there have been I think 100, if I'm not mistaken, or like tons of senators who have been named under the 10 years of Justin Trudeau, and they are all sitting as independent, which is a real departure from how things used to work there. And so there are fewer and fewer people who were named to the Senate as partisans, and I think that gives the Senate an incredible amount of potential influence over the different kinds of legislation that are going to be coming through there, because they are not necessarily tied to a party line, and then they're really able to kind of dig in and look further or ask questions that are challenging and that don't necessarily align with what a party wants. So they can have the potential. They don't always use it, but they have the potential to be pretty important, especially in a strong minority kind of government. Moving to the other place, to the House of Commons. So of course, yeah, the Carney government needed 172 or more seats to get a majority, and they are so close. They just as of this weekend have 170 MPs. Plus or minus one, or not plus or minus, it could be 170, it could be 169, depending on who wins the speakership. So what that means is the opposition parties have a really strong role to play. And with climate policy in particular, there are three parties that have made strong commitments to climate that are closely aligned. I know they probably don't like it if I say this, but they are closely aligned with what the Liberal Party has done in the past 10 years and has committed to do. And so let's start with the Green Party. I mean, they have one MP, Elizabeth May. She has indicated that she's going to be mostly supportive of the government's agenda. Of course, that could change if the government becomes, more pro-oil and gas. There's very little chance that she would vote with them, but of course, her vote does not necessarily, count for that much. It will if in the case that like one of the recounts that are happening right now flips a seat to Liberal and the Liberals have 171 seats, then Elizabeth May becomes like the Queen of Parliament, like the most important person for the Liberals to have on board. Otherwise, the NDP, of course, at 7 seats, it's been a huge blow to the NDP. And they definitely have a role to play with regards to climate. But that said, I think realistically, no one expects that the NDP wants to trigger an election. And you don't have to be a political PhD to understand that, right? And so I think that the prime minister is likely going to understand that and will probably act accordingly. So that doesn't necessarily mean that climate policy is safe. The Bloc Québécois, I think, is one that's really interesting for folks in English Canada who don't necessarily pay much attention to the Bloc. They had a really, really solid climate platform. They had it. They were the first party to put it out. They also did another report, especially on the cost of adaptation and how adaptation was necessary and what kind of policies should come out of that. They've been incredibly vocal about their how they don't want more pipelines, they don't want more fossil fuels. And so, the Bloc is going to be playing a really essential role, I think, despite the fact that they've lost a couple of MPs. They are unabashedly pro-renewable and anti-fossil fuel, and that's going to mean that the Liberals will have to tread carefully if they want to get legislation passed, especially legislation that could have an impact on fossil fuel growth, and specifically with regards to anything that goes through Quebec. I mean, that's even though the Liberals won like double the amount of seats in Quebec as the Bloc did, the Bloc is still going to be playing a really important role. And so for people who do advocacy, like I know that in the past government it was relatively simple because the NDP and the Liberals had signed a supply and confidence agreement, and so we could expect that on like really major confidence votes that they were going to vote together. In this case, it is very unlikely that happens, and in fact, Carney has said no, he doesn't want to sign a formal deal with anyone. But the Bloc is going to play a big role. And then just finally, with regards to Conservatives, I mean, we've seen a real rollback of climate ambition and climate policy since Poilievre became leader, and it appears to have worked to a certain extent. I mean, like they won more seats than they did in the past. Obviously, they were flying high in the polls until they weren't. And I don't necessarily know that they are going to be changing their tune with regards to climate. Especially with regards to energy. Like I think that's like they've made their bed on that one. With regards to adaptation, that's possibly where we could see a couple of different changes. I mean, and I don't have this study on hand, but there was a study that I saw that demonstrated that like the worst climate impacts to have happened in Canada over the past couple of years happened for the greatest part in conservative held ridings. And so I know that they're very sensitive to that issue, even if they don't necessarily call it climate impacts, but natural disasters, anything about security, anything about resilience, like these are conversations that they are open to having, and I think absolutely need to be taken into account when we speak to conservatives and meet with conservatives, because it is clearly something that has an impact on the people of their ridings and on their ability to get anything done, really, ultimately. So it's going to be an interesting parliament, but I would expect that it's going to last towards the longer end of the range. Like I don't think we're going to be going back to the polls over the next 18 months or 2 years. I think we might be able to have a little bit of a breather for the next 3, maybe 4 years. And so for me, that's a good thing.
If I were just to quickly sort of summarize and say what I think that's going to mean moving forward from a practical policy and political standpoint, I think Carney's been pretty clear that he wants to govern for all Canadians, and especially to kind of quell this Western separatism anxiety that seems to be bubbling close to the surface. I think he means it when he says build, baby, build. He is going to be focusing on energy development, I think all forms of energy. But to everything Alex said, I think he's also going to have political cover to make sure he is still speaking to Canadians who care about the environment and climate change, because as she mentioned, I mean, the Conservatives are probably not going to be wanting any of that. They are going to want drill, baby, drill, to just keep using those taglines. They're going to want more oil, more gas, and not much else. And while Carney will go forward with some of that, I think politically he will have to keep being active on the environment and climate change, which I think most people know he would also want to be at the same time. And he will have that political cover because he will know that to get anything passed, he's going to need to get some buy-in from either some mix of Elizabeth May and the Green Party or the NDP and or the Bloc, all of whom are fairly environmentally conscious. So we do have, I think, an optimistic thing to look forward to moving forward, in that they're going to have to appease those parties to some degree, and that can also serve as cover for him to make sure there is this environmental context on all of their policies and activities moving forward over the coming years.
Thanks. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move us along to talk a tiny bit about communication, the role of communication here. And I know we have some questions coming in the chat, so maybe we'll plan to go to about 2:05. And if you have more questions, please add them. Ross, we haven't heard from you in a bit, and you're an expert in carbon pricing, amongst other things. So, yeah, let's go back to the fact that it looked like this was going to be a carbon tax election once upon a time. Things evolved. I think there are a lot of lessons that have probably been learned about how the government communicates about climate policy, which is technical and complex. And I was looking during the election at the commitment to replace the consumer carbon price, I think, with the carbon border adjustment, which again is like not exactly the kind of thing we chat with our neighbors about easily over a backyard barbecue. So I just wanted to get your thoughts, Ross, on how the government can do a better job advancing its climate policies in a way that kind of keeps the public with it during these really turbulent times.
How to save carbon pricing. Oh goodness. I should start by saying that I'm not a communications expert. I'm a researcher who works with communications professionals, so any listeners out there should take my opinion with a grain of salt. But I think one of the things that was unfortunate about the way the federal fuel charge, the carbon tax, met its end is that the carve-outs that were introduced about 1.5 years ago kind of bought into the frame that climate policies and affordability are in tension, are in conflict. And when we talk about carbon pricing or climate policies, I don't think that's necessary. I don't think that there is necessarily a tension between them. And I'm sure everyone on this panel would agree there are actually really important ways that climate policies can reinforce affordability. If we stay on carbon pricing for a moment, I think there are other important arguments to consider. There are other important things for that we would hope the governments would say to Canadians. One is that the costs of the existing carbon pricing system, the industrial carbon pricing system, are low for industry and are designed that way to protect their competitiveness. We've crunched some numbers. One of my colleagues found that even at the high end, industrial carbon pricing costs something like a timbit per barrel of oil. So these are pretty moderate costs. The incentive is still there, but the point of the incentive is to encourage long-term competitiveness. Anyway, I'm getting into the wonky weeds, Sarah, which I realize is one of the challenges. I think it's important to resist the framing of affordability and climate policy being in tension. There are a whole host of ways that climate policies are good for competitiveness, are good for building things, are good for security, whether that's building safer homes, whether that's building more resilient competitive industries that can reach out into distant global markets that are looking to decarbonize. And yes, there's a cost to action, but the costs of inaction are much greater. Alex, you were mentioning statistics. One of the statistics from our research is that climate change is costing Canadians something on the order of $700 a year to each household. We expect climate impacts to shave something like $25 billion off of GDP as of this year. That's equal to roughly half the projected GDP growth. These are really enormous costs. And if we're talking about investing, if we're talking about building a more competitive, clean economy that, protects people, there's a really crucial role for climate policy there. And we think that's some of the framing that can be helpful.
Thanks, Ross. Andrew, maybe just in a minute here, which is a challenging thing to ask you to do, but you've written a lot about misinformation and the role that it played in this election, misinformation and disinformation. So maybe just some advice from you for the new government in terms of presenting a vision to Canadians around climate change threats and policies and how climate action fits into that vision in the face of all of that disinformation and misinformation, and now AI.
Well, I saw that we have a minister of AI now, so that's a good start. I mean, if I were going to be really brief about it, the next government needs to do a better job than the last. Because I do think it was a mix of a failure of effective communication along with a success in mis and disinformation about the carbon tax specifically, if we want to look at that. There was the back and forth of all of the costs of the carbon tax versus its revenue neutrality. It goes back to a lot of what Ross said. I think the government needs to get much better at effectively and succinctly communicating everything he just said to people in a way that matters to them. So it's going to shave off X billion dollars of GDP or GDP growth in the coming years, or it's going to cost 700 people. Can we show them more specifically what that looks like and how investments in X, Y, or Z decreases that $700, or it leads to an investment that makes their house worth more, right? There's all these kinds of things that we need to really meet people where they are and practically use the tools that are available to us to do so. And on the question of AI, one of the things that my research has demonstrated is people who are engaging in disinformation are getting much better at it because they can use the tools of AI to give targeted messaging based on the data that they harvest from people. They kind of know what types of messaging people are more susceptible to based on what they click on, what they linger on various sites. We need to do better similarly, not to have one communication strategy for the government's climate policy to all Canadians, because that's not going to speak to all Canadians effectively. But we need to really get better at targeted messaging about this is why this specific incentive is going to help you, and here's how much it's going to help you economically today and into the future, and have more targeted messages that more effectively speak to Canadians and, like we hear all the time, meet them where they are, so that our policy can meet them where they are. And to effectively do so, it's going to require a lot more thought going into a lot more complex strategies for climate communication that at the end of the day are actually much more simple and direct.
Okay, maybe we'll wrap this section up by turning it to Alex. Alex, what do you want to add to all of this? And in particular, can you talk to us not just about communication from the government, but communication from the range of other actors that play a role in shaping the way Canadians understand and feel support for climate action, including, the advocacy and environmental nonprofit space?
Yes. I think that to a certain extent, we need to use the KISS strategy, right? The keep it simple, stupid. Like it's these things are super complex for sure. But the more you can boil it down to like that elevator pitch, like quick, tangible win, show people what's in it for them. Like that, it's been proven again and again and again that like the theory of it, like the emissions reductions and like all of the principles piece doesn't really work in terms of convincing people that they need to take action on climate change. But what does is, saying, hey, look, this is going to, like, this heat pump is going to keep your home cool, so that in the summertime when it gets really hot, you're just going to have AC, and it's also going to shave off whatever, how many hundreds of dollars from your electricity or your heating bill in the wintertime. That's it. Like, you don't need to talk about the why. Like, it's like, I just feel like we have, as a climate movement, and I'm speaking for myself, like, we have kind of gone too quickly into the big picture, or into the really nitty gritty detail-y kind of stuff, where it's like, do we want this thing? Or, well, yes, but it's going to be complicated and it has to be done this exact way. When you think about the axe the tax narrative, right? It worked for a reason. And I think that part of that reason was, like, most people didn't actually get it. Like, like, I spoke with people who were like, he's going to axe all taxes. That's not at all what the conservatives were suggesting. But that's what people got from it, right? And I think to a certain extent, like, people who care about these kinds of policies, we tend to care about science. We tend to care about, like, policy making, where we have these kinds of procedural brains, but unless we're able to really sell it to folks, and make it really clear what the benefits are going to be, it's kind of a non-starter. I've worked my whole life on climate policy, and I really fundamentally care about it, but I also don't really care what it's called. And so if you want to call your heat pump a freedom pump, if you want to say an EV is just like, whatever, like super muscle motor, like, great, do it. I don't really care what it's called. And I think that we have to change our own mindset about how we are communicating these things, how we're selling these kinds of things, and how are we making these things tangible so that people get it. And once they get it, they don't want to go back. I don't know a single person who's, got an EV or got a heat pump, and now wants to go back to some kind of fossil fuel powered vehicle or home appliance, right? I know zero people like that. So, like, let's just make this unstoppable. And similarly with with the renewables revolution, it's unstoppable. The cost of wind and solar has dropped so much, and it's only continuing to drop. And even in places that are as, far right as Texas, they are being deployed because it just makes sense. And people are able to really grasp that very quickly. And so let's just make this whole thing make sense to your average person.
Okay, well, thank you to everybody. We'll take a few minutes just to answer a couple of questions from our participants, our audience here today. And Alex, you just talked about places that are making big investments in solar. So maybe I'll just turn to the question from Angela here in the chat, which I don't know if you can see, but it just says China ? Which I actually think is a really great way to frame the question about what kind of role China might be likely to play in terms of influencing Canada's agenda, the clean energy transition, um, uh, election and democracy stuff. So, maybe I'll turn it to Andrew first and just sort of ask for comments on China ?
What kind of role will they play? A huge one. It is the second largest economy in the world. It's growing fast. It is, if you look at all the positive markers that you would hope an economy is doing to pursue sustainability, it's basically leading the world in every way. It's bringing on more sustainable technologies and energies and renewable energies in every way, and it is really leading the transition in so many ways. Now, it's also one of it's still the biggest polluting economy and country in the world. It's bringing on insane amounts of oil, gas, and coal production all the time. So there's a lot of problems with that as well. But the simple fact is, with these kinds of sustainable renewable technologies, the more that they are adopted, the cheaper they become. And that's why over the past couple of years, renewable energies have become the cheapest form of energy. And to the point that Alex just mentioned, it makes no sense to invest in other types of energy at this point on most scales, especially when it comes to electricity production, right? And we are going to see these kinds of shifts happening. And while China is going to be a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the coming years and continue to be a problem, it is going to help drive that transition in a number of ways. That being said, it's also going to make things much more complicated on the geopolitical world. If you want to think about election interference or simply the ongoing trade tensions between the US and China, or more broadly, kind of the East and the West, as we see this sort of return to a Cold War, that don't necessarily help these kinds of things, right? If countries can be more ideologically aligned on more issues, they can more effectively cooperate. And we're clearly not seeing great cooperation between that East and West, if we want to simplify it that way. But that being said, again, just to quickly say, I think one reason for optimism is that as much as tensions have escalated between China and Canada, the US, and many other countries in recent years, cooperation on the climate change file has continued. And it does seem to be one of those issues that China is going to keep engaging in, probably positively, while also having a lot of problems moving forward. But that is one thing that I think that we can continue to hold to from a cooperation standpoint, as they do help us globally with the transition to more renewable energy sources.
I mean, I don't know if Russell's going to jump in, but yes to everything that Andrew just said. I think one other piece is just, under the Biden administration, the United States took a very different stance with regards to China. And I'm thinking like specifically about the EVs, where they imposed strong tariffs on Chinese built EVs, and Canada followed suit. Now I know that things are really in flux with China and the United States these days, because just over the weekend there were changes made, and yesterday too. So it's like I can't speak to that, but I do think that Canada has an opportunity here to develop its own kind of approach to China and feelings about China and Chinese built products, and in many cases, I mean, like, there are absolutely labor issues, there are human rights issues that really need to be addressed for sure. But ultimately, like, China still is leading the way with regards to a whole bunch of different technologies that are needed to decarbonize. And so, there have to be questions asked in Canada about whether we want to kind of deploy our own manufacturing sector, like to build heat pumps or solar panels and things like that, when they can be produced in China. I don't know what the answer is going to be to that, honestly, but I think that we might see some kind of significant shifts with regards to Canada's approach overall to Chinese products over the coming years, especially if Donald Trump keeps playing strange games with tariffs and China.
Thanks, Alex. I'm going to just wrap with a final question. Maybe I'll turn this one to Ross, but the question is, does Canada have the workforce that it needs to in terms of skills, or even just the number of workers that we need to carry out the kind of agenda that we expect to see from the government? And what kind of support exists to build up the kind of workforce that we need in the clean economy?
That's a great question, to which I do not have a satisfying or well thought through answer. My understanding, this is not an area that I work in, is that finding the workforce for some of the kinds of decarbonization projects and clean growth projects that Canada wants to pursue is challenging. I've heard Michael Sabia, the CEO of Hydro-Québec, talk about the enormous challenges of finding the workforce to pursue their massive build out of electrification capacity. Hydro-Québec has a very ambitious strategy costing tens of billions of dollars that's planned to increase their capacity, increase their efficiency over the coming years. And my understanding is they're looking for something like 35,000 workers for those projects, and finding those workers, making sure that they have the skills, making sure that they have the language capacities to do that work, is a really big challenge. And I'm sure that that is not the only organization that's facing challenges. It exists at a smaller scale too. Finding contractors who know heat pumps really well and know how to install them is a challenge. And it's these little details that can slow down the implementation of the big, ambitious policy agenda that governments may have. So it's a prescient question. My understanding is that there are challenges. There may be challenges finding the workforce to follow through on some climate initiatives. And when it comes to policy, I know this is a file that governments are attuned to. but I can't speak knowledgeably about the policy initiatives, so I won't wade into that space.
Okay. Well, I know there's so much more we could get into. Sorry, my doorbell is ringing. Um, I promised that we would wrap before 2:15, so we won't do that. I apologize to folks who asked questions that we didn't get a chance to turn to. Lots to look out for ahead here, though. So I'd like to thank Andrew and Alex and Ross for a super interesting conversation here today. I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in and actually did stay for an extra 10 minutes for the question and answer portion of this conversation. I'd like to thank GreenPAC's sponsors for making it possible for us to hold events like these. I don't know if I'm seeing what you're seeing on the screen, but I believe we do have a survey that I'll let you give us some feedback about what you thought about this event that we'd be pleased to receive. And I'll wrap it there with thanks to everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Have a great day.